First of all, welcome. Thank you all for being here today at the California Water Data Consortium's Data for Lunch with Dr. Letitia Grenier from San Francisco Estuary Institute. I'm Tara Moran, CEO of the California Water Data Consortium. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the consortium, we were founded in 2019 to support implementation of the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, or AB 1755. And as all of you well know, data can and should be at the heart of informed data or water management here in California and beyond. And so that really is the vision for the consortium, which is that in partnership with state agencies, NGOs, the private sector, tribes, academia, and many others, we support the development and improved accessibility to high quality, trusted water data to support better outcomes for everyone living and working in California. And so the goal of our Data for Lunch series is to learn about new and innovative water-related data methods or technologies or tools. But in addition to that is really to provide a venue to learn from and connect with one another. And so we're really excited to have Dr. Letitia Grenier from SFEI here with us today to talk about the Delta Landscapes scenario planning tool. And I'm particularly excited because, as you'll hear during the presentation, this tool is a set of resources that have been developed to assist users with analyzing and evaluating different land use scenarios in the Delta, with the goal of really helping to drive decision-making there. And so we're excited to hear more about that, as well as to think more with all of you about its potential applications. And so who better to facilitate this conversation than Susan Tatayan, chair of the Delta Stewardship Council and member of the California Water Data Consortium Steering Committee. So I'm really glad to have you here. Thank you for being here today, Susan. And before I hand things over to her to formally introduce today's speaker, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping items. Our Data for Lunch series will take a break over the winter holidays and will resume in 2022. If you have suggestions for other Data for Lunch topics, please reach out to either myself or our program manager, Amanda Miller. We'll drop our contact information in the chat. For the flow of today's meetings, after Susan introduces our speaker, we'll hand things over to Dr. Grenier, who will give about a half-hour presentation. After that, we'll have time for questions, which Susan and I will be moderating. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat. Be sure to include both your name and affiliation. Alternatively, feel free to raise your hand electronically. We'll be tracking those, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. And similar to prior events, our speaker has graciously agreed to stay on Zoom for sort of some informal discussion after we sort of close out the formal portion of the meeting at 1. So again, please feel free to stay on if you want to have some less formal discussion during that time. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, slides and a recording of today's presentation will be available on our website after the event. So if you are not already part of the consortium's listserv, I would encourage you to subscribe on our website to receive updates both on presentations and recordings, as well as other consortium events and news. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Susan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am very excited to join Tara in welcoming all of you to the consortium's Data for Lunch Brown Bag series, and pleased to introduce Dr. Letitia Grenier from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. Her full bio is on the event page as well as on the consortium's website, so you can reference the website for more detail about Dr. Grenier. Dr. Grenier directs the Resilient Landscapes program at SFEI, where she works with partners to conserve California's natural resources by developing collaborative, science-based landscape scale visions and solutions. And the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool was created by Dr. Grenier and her inventive team to quantify landscape performance and provide the science needed to support decision-making about large-scale ecosystem restoration and land use in the Delta region. And I view this open source tool as a really powerful visualization tool that helps us further ecosystem-based management in the Delta watershed. So thank you very much for your time and attention today and joining us to learn more about this important tool. And Dr. Grenier, on to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here, Susan and Tara. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group. And it's great that we're going to have time for dialogue, because there'll be a little bit of me talking first, but then it's going to be really fun to hear from you and get your thoughts on what I'm going to present today. So because you have data in your title of Data for Lunch, I went ahead and used words that people who like data like user-driven science and decision support, because that's really what we're doing with this work. We're trying to take pretty hardcore data, what is available out there, and massage it to a place where it's digested and ready to be applied or operationalized for decision making. So that truly is what this work is about, and I hope we can get into your thoughts on how useful it might be when we get to the discussion. And our goal, as the subtitle says, is a resilient multi-benefit delta. And that's pretty much what we want everywhere. So I really liked what Susan brought out about this idea of gaming out future scenarios in a tool that tells you, what might you get in terms of benefits and impacts, trade-offs in these future landscapes. I think that's a really useful idea to take to lots of different parts of the world, and especially places like California, where we have a lot of people and a lot of impacts to these ecosystems, and yet we need a lot of things from them. So this is, I think, as climate change and population pressure kind of increase the challenges that we're facing trying to manage landscapes, the more we start to put ecosystems back together in thoughtful ways so that they can have synergistic interactions of the different parts of the system to benefit us, to benefit nature and wildlife, the better off we will all be. Will you move to the next slide? I forgot that I am not controlling that. Okay, I'll just a quick thought about myself. I grew up walking my dog with this view. This is San Elijo Lagoon in Southern California, highly altered landscape, yet functional. And I think that's really, I didn't even know this was a salt marsh when I was a kid, but I did grow up to get a PhD in salt marsh ecology. So these early experiences, this early access to nature really does matter. And it's made me think a lot about environmental justice and, who benefits from the nature that's out there, who has access to it. It's something we need to be thinking about as we're thinking about water in California, which is such a precious resource. But anyway, despite the fact that there's a lot going on here, there's a railroad berm and a road between this estuary, this tidal marsh, and the ocean. You can't tell, but there's some fences and other things, the PG&E lines going through here, like pretty much most of our estuaries. But it really works. And this is one of the most important birding sites in the Pacific Flyway. People come here, you can see really cool stuff here in this kind of messed up, highly modified estuary. So, if we think about the Delta as a wonderful yet messed up and highly modified estuary, we can think about how can we get it to that future functional multi-benefit, less fragile, more resilient landscape. And that's what the intent of this project. Next slide. So that was a little bit about me and my organization called the San Francisco Estuary Institute / Aquatic Science Center, very sexy name. What we're really about is taking science and translating it into operationalized information for decision makers. So we're really about trying to really digest everything that's out there in terms of data and academic science and shorten the time that it takes for it to be used in thoughtful decision making around California's natural resources, and especially water. Next slide. So we're going to be talking about the Delta. One of the things that we do in my group often is the historical ecology of a place. And for California, that means thinking about what did this place look like? What were the plants and animals and people that lived here? How did the landscape work before the significant modification by European settlers that happened over the past 150, 200 years? This is what the Delta used to look like. It was a big wetland. It was one big freshwater tidal marsh, more or less. There was a lot of diversity and a lot of interesting things going on in there, but that's what it was. It doesn't look like that now. Next slide. Now it's a big agricultural area, and we've channelized the wetlands into basically canals. So it's really a totally different kind of ecosystem. Next slide. And we're looking for the future that could be possible, that because of the modifications we've made, we've created an ecosystem that's it's not delivering everything we want it to deliver, and it's not going to be resilient in the future, with especially sea level rise and various other stressors like earthquakes. We could have some real problems. And it's such an important ecosystem that we need to find a way to make the levees more stable, to make the water supply more reliable, to bring back the endangered species. And there's a lot of other ecosystem services we can get out of this landscape, including treating nutrients with wetlands and sequestering and storing carbon. Next slide. So the work of the landscape scenario planning tool that I will get to, I promise I will get there, but I want to give you a little bit of history about the Delta and our science in the Delta. And the reason I want to do that is to help you understand the thinking that's gone into this tool. This is not a tool about fish and flows. This is a tool that's holistically thinking about this ecosystem, what it used to be in the past, what it is now, what it could be in the future, bringing together all the data and science we can find about that and synthesizing that into answering management questions. And these are things like, what are the functions we want the Delta to perform for people and for nature and wildlife? How could the Delta perform those in a resilient way over time into the future? So we're trying to be very holistic, and we're thinking at a large scale. We're thinking over long time scales. We're thinking about how can we get these functions restored via natural processes so we don't have to do a lot of management, which we know is expensive and difficult to maintain over long time periods. Next slide. So because you're a water people, I decided to show this slide of how the Delta has changed. So we know this is California, we have wet years and dry years. So the two maps on the left are the historical dry years, what we think the habitats used to look like then in terms of hydrologically connected areas. So these are areas that would have been functionally connected by water during that year, basically flooding, but not, but actual real functional connections. And then we had the historical wet years where that area is slightly larger, but it's not dissimilar because there was such great hydrological connectivity back then. And then you can see the modern dry years and the modern wet years, with the big difference being that we get that activation in the Yolo bypass and a little bit more in the Cosumnes. But overall, so you can see the big change is not from dry to wet, but it's from historical to modern. We've taken this vast wetland. I'll just give you one statistic, 98% of the tidal marsh is gone. So that's a pretty severe modification of a landscape, changing it to what it is now. Next slide. And that kind of change has implications for the wildlife that evolved in this place. One of those being the state threatened black rail. And this is just an analysis that's based on the patch sizes that are needed for black rails to reach their highest densities within marshes. And the reason I chose that, I'm not going to get into the details here, but the point is we don't choose patch sizes randomly or arbitrarily. We're always thinking about a function. How can we create a Delta that has marshes that will support high densities of our native birds? That's like one of the questions we would be asking. And then we would do this analysis based on data on our native birds like black rail to figure out, well, how big do the patches need to be to get those high densities? And so you can see there's been a huge change from large historical patches to lots of small, scattered, tiny, fragmented patches. So pretty typical story, fragmentation of wetlands. Next slide. And here's the difference in inundation or flooding patterns. Each of the different colors is a different kind of flooding. And that means it was a different depth. It was a different duration of flooding. It often had a different kind of hydrology in terms of how long it lasted or what time of year. And so these had different functions. You can see there was a lot of diversity and a great extent of flooding. Again, that's really changed now. We have much less flooding, many fewer kinds, much less time of year, et cetera. And we're all familiar with the work that salmon and many other species do very well on floodplains, because floodplain is a kind of wetland, sort of a temporary wetland that's seasonal, and wetlands make lots of food for the food web. Next slide. So one of the things, again, we always think about is the function. So we actually quantified the loss of food that has occurred due to the loss of wetlands in the Delta and other hydrologically connected habitat types, which I showed you earlier. And what's interesting is that there are certain habitats that are high leverage. So basically marshes kind of punch above their weight in terms of making food. So when we lost some of these wetland types like marshes, we disproportionately lost that function of making food or fueling the food web. And this, of course, is one of the major reasons scientists think that our fish, our native fish, are not doing well in the Delta, is that it's starved of food, more or less. So this is one of the reasons that we think putting wetlands back in will help our native fish. Next slide. And I just want to point out that it's not just fragmentation, because that's such an idea in landscape ecology and conservation biology, but often in waterscapes, we have overconnected, which is confusing. We've fragmented the wetlands and the land, but we've overconnected the water. And what we're looking at here is a photograph of channel cuts where you can see that there were these really looping channels going through this very flat area. This is probably the San Joaquin, yep. And they were cut through with these channel cuts to make it easier to navigate. But that really changes how fast the water moves through and the patterns in the hydrology. So we have actually overconnected the water and made it more homogeneous, which is kind of the opposite of what we've done with the wetlands and the land. Next slide. And this is just a look at a larger scale to show that it's hard to see in the gray. The little dark blue channels are all gone. I'll show you that in the next slide, but the yellow is what's been added. And so this creates a homogenization of the water, which is just like homogenizing land habitats. It's like you turned all your land habitats into oak forest. That would not be good. Turning all your water habitats into large channels has had implications as well. Next slide. And the reason I'm going through all this is to show you this is the science that underlies the metrics in the tool you're going to see. You actually have to know and understand all this science and have figured out these metrics to be able to build the tool that can then quantify outcomes of different future scenarios. So what I'm showing you here is ways that change on the land has impacted function. Then we can use the measurement of that change on the functions in the tool. Hopefully this will make sense. So this is just looking really quickly at the channels. The light green channels are those dendritic networks of tidal marsh channels where the tide goes in, stops, tide comes out, kind of like your arteries. They're feeding, these really important areas of wetlands. And those are all gone because, of course, those wetlands have largely become agriculture. But what we have left is these big red channels, which are those large ones I showed you that have actually been overconnected. So there's actually been a flip-flop in the area of open water to wetland, and it's just a massive change in how the ecosystem functions. And if one of the analogies I've given before when presenting this is, imagine if somebody kept all your big blood vessels but got rid of all the little capillaries and veins, you would not be feeling that good. And that's exactly how the delta is feeling if we can anthropomorphize it. Functionally, in terms of its ecology, it's suffering from the lack of these wetlands and these channels that bring water, sediment, food, biota. Next slide. And so what that means if you're a fish, to get more practical about it, is that if you, let's say you're a young salmon, you're cruising down the San Joaquin River, not that there's too many of those anymore, naturally, but back in the day, you would have been able to go down one of these small side channels, which are now gone, and suddenly you have way more cover from predators. There's actually way more food where the residence time gets higher and the water speed is much lower. So it's a place to rest, it's a place to eat, it's a place to get fat and strong before you go out to sea. And we know that that's what salmon need to be able to survive and return and spawn. So there are real functional outcomes that relate to these landscape changes. I know I'm hitting this idea really hard, but that's the idea behind this tool, that we can use science to understand how change on the land actually creates change in functions we care about, like supporting salmon. Next slide. And so if you look at a larger scale than just that one channel I showed you, you can see for this example from the McCallamy, where there used to be 32 places to stop and rest and get fat for smolt who are leaving, there are now none. So that's problematic, if you're trying not to get eaten and you're trying to get big and fat. And then on the right, it just shows, there's sort of a theoretical idea that salmon could go, based on some empirical data, salmon can go about 19.5 kilometers a day. I don't think they would want to, because historically they probably only had to go a couple kilometers a day. If you look at this, the bar on the left is so small how many kilometers they used to have to go, but that dotted brownish line shows how many they may be able to go now. But what they have to go in this particular gauntlet that we're showing is, 39.5 kilometers, or 30, I think it's 39.5. It's just too far. And so it explains why so many of them are dying in the Delta. Next slide. They, just to point out mechanistically how they die, they usually get eaten by a predator along the way there. There's a lot of large fish, especially invasive species, in those big channels. Okay, so to summarize what I've showed you in terms of the science, the Delta is fragmented in some ways, next slide, but it's also overconnected in other ways. So you really do have to understand how the landscape functions, next slide. And what we need to do is to use this understanding to think, how can we put back just what is needed in the landscape to get just the functions we want? And to do that, you really need to think at this big scale. And that's why the tool helps, because it's a big ecosystem. And it's not going to work if we design all the pieces of this system separately. I know some of you have heard this, but my analogy often uses a car. If we all design the parts of a car separately without talking to each other, the car is not going to run. That's a team project, and we need ecosystems to be designed with teamwork, where we're all talking to each other about how the different pieces of this are going to work together. Next slide. And so that's why we wanted to create this tool. As we're trying to do this big team project across this huge landscape that's so important for delivering water and agriculture, and the culture, the human culture that's there, and the boating and the fishing and so many things that we care about, including endangered species and these ecological functions, we need a standard, transparent, science-based way of thinking about what those different futures could be, and then making decisions, because of course there's going to be trade-offs. There's going to be different benefits from different scenarios. And once you have, more than one or two things you're trying to keep in your head, you really need to get it down on paper and be able to look at, maybe the 20 or 30 things that actually matter to people and how we're balancing them against each other. Next slide. And so that's the one I already said. We basically need a simple and standardized way to think about scenarios. Next slide. And then we also need to be able to see how we're going to get to our performance measures, right? So with the Delta plan, we're actually trying to hit certain performance measures over time. And with something that takes as long as wetland restoration, I mean, it could take you 10 or 20 years to get this thing permitted and funded. And then it has to build up, using natural processes in the real world. You need to plan ahead for whether you're going to hit those performance measures. You can't just do it on the fly. Next slide. And then evaluating proposals. So let's say you're the Delta Conservancy or some other group that's handing out funding. You're going to want to think about which of the proposals I'm getting are actually helping move us toward this a future sustainable Delta that we want to see, or toward the Delta plan performance measures. Next slide. And then once you actually have projects on the ground, you can use the tool to track how you're doing. Are the projects delivering on what you hope they would do? You can get a new map and see, did you get a wetland there that you thought you were going to get, et cetera? Are you getting the sizes of patches that you were hoping for? Are the impacts to agriculture what you thought they were going to be? Next slide. So now I will actually tell you a little bit about the tool itself. This is a tool that's available online. You can download it right now and use it. You do need ArcGIS to use it. So you need some amount of expertise, but it's a totally open tool that's available to share. And it's been built in a modular way. So I'm going to tell you about certain modules, we call them, that the tool can analyze. And within those modules, there will be many metrics usually. So I'll explain that. But we can add more. And that's one of the things that I think is really useful for you all to be thinking about. Is this an interesting, useful thing for you or not? And if you could add something to this, what would it be? So there's sort of three parts to the tool. First, you have to input these alternative future scenarios. What would the landscape look like under different scenarios? And you can do up to 3 of those, in addition to a historical scenario. So you can look back at that sort of 1800 to 1850-ish time frame and see, how does this compare to how that less impacted landscape used to work, and also the current present day scenario. And then you input that data as the user, and we actually have a scenario builder that can help you. And then behind the scenes, the tool actually goes and analyzes what those different future scenarios would do in terms of delivering functions based on the kind of science that I have just been presenting to you, how changes in the landscape relate to changes in functions that we are interested in. And so the modules that are in the tool right now are a summary module that just shows you everything that I'm about to, all the other modules together. One that shows you the extent of different habitat types and their diversity. One that looks at how well marsh wildlife is supported, particularly tidal marsh. One that looks at how woody riparian wildlife is supported. One that looks at how wetland buffers are working, and how fish are supported, which is of course important to lots of people. One that looks at just inundation, because that physical process is so important for supporting a lot of different functions. One that looks at subsidence, so how does this affect land elevations? One that looks at agriculture. Many of the scenarios that we would be planning are going to impact agriculture, since that's most of what's out there. So if you want to put something new in the Delta, you're likely going to lose some agriculture to be able to do that. Infrastructure, how many different pieces of infrastructure that are already on the land would be impacted by this, because we know that's a huge challenge to move things and to get permits. Where are the protected areas? That can be useful for thinking about how to do work on public land so that we minimize our footprint of impact to private land and ag in the Delta. And then physical suitability, always remembering that you can't put a tidal marsh 10 meters below sea level. That's not tidal anymore, that's subtidal. So things like that, just as a quick check on making sure that some of the input parameters are reasonable. And what you get out is a detailed report on how these functions would perform to the best of our knowledge using the best available science and data under those different scenarios. And you actually get that in terms of graphs, you get maps, you get tables, and you can get that all. It all comes in either a web page or a PDF. So we're trying to make this as user-friendly as possible. And it can actually come out in a data file that you could then input into another model. So that might be nice if you're doing some kind of carbon model or hydrodynamic modeling where you just want to take a data file and feed it right into another model. Next slide. So we do have this scenario developer, which is, and you'll find it there on the website, deltaplanningmap.sfei.org, where we have what we call guiding data sets, what we think are some of these really useful data sets, and you can visualize, you can play around with that and visualize the different kinds of data that you might want to use to build your scenario. And then you can certainly download and modify those data and make your own scenario. Next slide. And so just briefly showing you what the tool outputs look like. This is in a browser. You can see this is coming up as an HTML page, but you can also get it as a PDF. On the left, you'll see maps of your different scenarios. So this one is showing the modern scenario, which is basically the present day situation. And then the eco restore scenario. And I'll be showing you that one throughout this talk. It's the yellow bar, if you look at the bar graph down on, or the orangish bar, if you look down on the right. And Eco Restore is California Department of Fish and Wildlife's long-term restoration plan. So as more and more large restoration projects get added into the Delta, they tend to get added to this Eco Restore sort of a consortium of projects. And then on the right, you'll see there's a little description of what that metric is. So you can see in that gray bar at the top, you're in the marsh habitat module. And this is the marsh patch size metric. And then I think there's like 6 other metrics or 5 other metrics within this module. And it'll give you detailed information. So we're trying to provide the data in a lot of different ways so it's accessible to a lot of different users to be helpful in their decision making. Next slide. And then the first module you'll get back is the summary module. And what I wanted to show you here is that if you look at, again, we're looking at the marsh habitat module, look at the table down here on the right, and then each one of those rows is a metric, something that is actually measured from those spatial data that are in the scenarios that you've put into it. And then we've tried to do some coding, like the green shows you where we think you're getting a better outcome in terms of that metric, and the dots are the best outcome. We're playing around with different ways to help quickly understand the large amount of data that you're getting. Next slide. And then you can also, I'm a visual person, this works way better for me. This is looking at the marsh module, looking at the marsh habitat metrics and seeing like, okay, how do these scenarios compare? Well, when I look at the graph on the top left, the number of large marsh patches, wow, if we do this eco restore module, we are going to make a difference here in the number of large marsh patches. That's great. And that's not a random metric that we threw out there just because patch size, is important. Remember back to that black rail data. We're setting thresholds here of 100 acres that's meaningful in terms of the function of supporting marsh wildlife. So just a reminder that we're trying to make these meaningful graphs always. And I won't go through each one, but you get the idea. You can think about different aspects of that future landscape in terms of how well it will support marsh wildlife. Next slide. Oh, and this is just to show, this is getting back to the black rails and this functionality question again. How big should a marsh patch be? We had a report, one of our reports said, well, you want to have big marsh patches. Well, how big? How big is a question for society? You could have a 500,000 hectare marsh patch again. That was the historical size, more or less. And we're not saying that. What we want to say is, here's what you might get. functionally if you choose different size patches. So if you look at these round black circles on the right, the 2 hectare patch is a minimum patch size to get you a black rail pair, a pair of those marsh birds coming into your patch. But if you have a 100 hectare patch, that's the minimum patch size to support a dense population of black rails. And that's what I was showing you before. But if you can get to a 500 hectare patch size, that's when you get those dendritic channels, like your arteries coming in and out of the marsh. You have to have a big enough marsh to actually sustain the sort of energy in the tidal channels so that those channels stay there. And that's when you really start getting all these other benefits. You're going to probably get more carbon sequestration, you're going to get more food production for fish, et cetera. And so we try to show that there's sort of different levels of return on investment when you're thinking about how, what's the function I want to get back and how big is the ecosystem that I want to create, or how big is this element of the ecosystem that I want to create to get that function. Next slide. And so I'm going to show you another example of how thinking spatially and at a large scale really does matter, and the tool can help us do that. This is looking in the fish support module of the landscape scenario planning tool, and we've got our 3 scenarios: the historical, the modern, and the eco-restore. And the 2 pink colors, so the blue color, if you look in the graph in the middle, is the historical situation where, and this is similar to what I showed you before, that fish used to have to travel very short distances to get to another big wetland, and big wetlands have been correlated with better outcomes for fish. And it's for all the reasons I said before. It's because, there's a difference in velocity, there's more food, there's places to hide from predators. And so it's good to have that blue bar be bigger. In the modern delta, a lot of the area, as you can see, is light pink and dark pink. And light pink means you have to travel as a fish 2 to 15 kilometers to get to that nearest large wetland patch, and more than 15 kilometers to get to that nearest wetland patch in dark pink. And that 15-kilometer threshold is similar to the 19.5 one I showed you earlier. It's just, I think it's generalized for more fish species, but basically, dark pink is worse than light pink. And what you can see, if you would go to the next slide, this is the current situation. Much of the delta is not in that good blue color. The map is now, mostly pink and dark pink. And so over much of the delta, fish have to travel a long way. And then if you toggle back and forth between the slide you're on now and the one before, back and, whoop, so that one and the next one and back and just between those, that one and the one before it. Sorry, I should have thought of this when I asked you guys to share the slides. What I'm trying to show here is that between what we have now and what eco-restore will do, you can see that the wetland patches, the green area, gets bigger between, go back and forth one more time. The green area gets bigger as we implement eco-restore and restore these large wetlands, but we're restoring them exactly where we already have large wetlands. We are not, yes, we're making more big wetlands. We're not making them in places that are going to solve this issue for fish that need to have these wetlands where they can stop and eat on the way out of the delta. So to me, that's a really interesting insight that I didn't quite get until we put this into the tool and we could look at this and we said, wow, eco-restore is not moving the needle on creating more places for fish to stop and eat as they exit the delta. And that is, of course, super important for salmon. So I think it's those kinds of, I don't know, aha moments or whatever. That's those kinds of understanding that we can get out of this kind of tool, where we realize that we can be doing really good things and it can be really helpful in lots of ways, but it's not going to maybe help with certain functions that are important to us. Next slide. And then the tool can look at subsidence. So how does your future scenario impact land elevation, which is of course important for lots of things, but not the least of which is, we can stabilize levees by helping with subsidence, and that by stabilizing levees, we can make our water supply more reliable and less of a chance of having a catastrophic saltwater going to Southern California event if levees fail due to flooding or earthquakes. So subsidence really matters. And while we're filling up that elevation space, that volume, we can be doing it by storing carbon. So there's a lot of good things we can do. We're adding a carbon module. We don't have that right now, but we should have that soon. Next slide. And we do, a lot of what the tool does now is very focused on ecological restoration and ecological functions like supporting wildlife or making food for the food web. But we also do want to have this tool be useful to think about economic impacts. So we looked at, okay, if you implement the eco-restore scenario, how is agriculture impacted? So we have a module on this. Next slide. And I think eco-restore impacts about 2% of the agriculture in the Delta overall. And then this shows you which crop types are impacted. So mostly pasture at this point. Not surprisingly, it's not the really, it's not vineyards and orchards. Someday we're going to come to deal with that conflict because those tend to be at higher elevation, and elevation is everything. But for this set of initial restorations, perhaps we're impacting one of the agricultural types that is more acceptable, or in terms of economics, more doable. Next slide. So briefly, I want to just tease you with this presentation, which really is best given by Allison Whipple, but I will do my best. She's one of the people in our inventive team. I love that descriptor. And this is a partnership with a lot of folks, as you can see across the bottom, notably the Nature Conservancy, Conservation Farms and Ranches, well, everybody, Hydro Focus and University of Merced, notably all of them. This was a really great collaborative effort, trying to say what should happen with Staten Island, which is currently managed to grow corn and support sandhill cranes, but it's challenging financially and physically because the island goes from not very subsided at the top to quite subsided at the southern end. And so there's a lot of challenges to farming there. Also, as sea level rises, I think the Nature Conservancy rightfully is thinking, how are we going to make a place where the sandhill cranes can definitely be supported, even if, ultimately this island is too low for that as sea level rises. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, sorry. One more. Okay. So what we're ultimately trying to do on Staten Island, and I really admire the forward-thinking nature of Dawit Zaleke and others who are working to think about this, who manage that land. What are the possible future land scenarios? How can we create this resilient, sustainable delta into the future, both economically, socially, and environmentally? Next slide. And so all the modules of the landscape scenario planning tool, and this just shows how everybody contributed. Next slide. What was happening at the time when this project was going is we hadn't built these modules into the landscape scenario planning tool, but they are all being built in there now. So what I'm going to show you is it wasn't actually an analysis of the tool, but is the kind of thing that we should be able to do in the future. So what's really interesting, if you look at the red outline there in the middle, that is Staten Island. It's right in between the fluvial and tidal part of the delta. So it's at a wonderful ecotone and has a lot of different sort of special hydrological functions. Next slide. But also challenges, and you can see there's a gradient of soil types going from more inorganic like mud to organic soils like peat. Next slide. And that limits what's possible to do on the land, these elevation differences and soil type differences. So using real on the ground knowledge of people who know what they're doing on that island and know the land really well, we came up with these 6 different scenarios as a team and compared them in terms of what are the functions that these scenarios could deliver. And what I love about this is it gets to a realistic, this is not just about restoring tidal marsh and other wetlands. This is about thinking about rice and other crops mixed in potentially with managed wetlands or tidal wetlands, which can now start to get revenue from the carbon market. So this is the real future that we're thinking about, and that I'm sure many of you are thinking about, what is the appropriate mix out there that's going to deliver the net most benefits that can be there. And even in terms of just making money for farmers, it's possible that starting to move toward more polluticulture or wetland agriculture like rice and more full-on just non-tidal and tidal wetlands may be part of the mixture that we need to have success. Next slide. And so, like I showed you before, they created, looking across these 6 different scenarios. Here's the different functions we're thinking about, which are, which scenarios are better and worse and which ones are best. And you can see just by the asterisks where they said, well, these are probably the best scenarios for that function, that it's a trade-off. And it's always going to be a trade-off. That's why this is complicated and you need a tool to help you figure it out. It's not like, oh, scenario F, it's a no-brainer. So this is, helps you start to think about, okay, well, I'm probably looking at scenarios C through F because A and B don't have any stars. It helps you start to hone in on what you're looking at. Next slide. And I'm not going to go through all the different ecologically focused metrics in this particular analysis because I did that before, but For example, if you're the Nature Conservancy and you're very concerned about cranes, and I personally am, they're amazing, cool birds and wonderful, you're going to be wanting to think about, well, which have the best support for cranes in terms of both foraging and roosting habitat. And those were scenario E and F. So there were a number of those different kinds of metrics that were looked at, not just crane support. Next slide. And you're going to be thinking about subsidence reversal, because again, the lower part of the island, the southern part, is very low relative to sea level. And it's creating issues for both being able to farm it and also for being able to maintain the levees, which is really expensive. So you're going to be thinking about scenario D, which helps more with subsidence reversal. Next slide. And then you're going to be thinking about greenhouse gas flux. Anywhere where we have those dry land farming on peat soils, we are still burning through the peat and letting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So it's a lot of these agricultural practices out there in the Delta are pretty costly in terms of greenhouse gases. So how can we get improvements? What's the mix of agriculture, rice, and natural wetlands to improve greenhouse gas flux? And that's scenario F. I'm not going to go through everyone. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of how this works. Next slide. And this is just to show you why. Here's the data that go behind it in terms of, these are detailed spatial data based on models out of hydrofocus that help us think through the greenhouse gas implications of these scenarios. Next slide. And then finally, getting down to, what really matters in terms of being able to do some of these things. What are the economic trade-offs? And so you can actually add up the revenue that you might get from the different land use, polygons in your scenario, and look at, wow, E and F I've talked about a lot as we go through this. Those are actually pretty good in terms of revenue. So this is starting to help us think about, okay, what are the functions that matter most to me? Which ones can I afford? D is not making nearly as much money, but it came up earlier as one of the useful ones. So you can imagine the discussion that you'd be having with your group of stakeholders, trying to figure out what you want to do. Next slide. So hopefully these examples are, especially, the Staten Island one, which reflects our newer modules involved in the tool, are helping you see what the idea is behind this tool. And I just want to sort of give you the big vision that we often think about, is that this tool can be really inclusive. Maybe you're a bass fisherman and the only thing you care about, or your top priority, is to have big bass be able to catch out there. We could make a spatial tool for that based on data on where people have been catching those kinds of fish. And then if your metric was added to the tool about the bass fishery, then suddenly what you're interested in is going to be visible and included in these tables and graphs. And suddenly every planner who's looking at the tool could see what matters to you. And I think there's probably lots of things that are missing along those lines. But the vision in my mind is that if we can be really inclusive and put in here all the different functions that different stakeholder groups care about, then we can really get that full picture analysis of how can we, thoughtfully, intentionally design a resilient, just, and sustainable future Delta. So we're not going to end up with this past, view. Next slide. But I also think we're not going to have what we have now. Next slide. We're going to look at that future vision. And I think this is outdated now. I think we made this. This is a rendering that's a student at UC Berkeley helped us make in 2014. But I think if we added this now, we'd start to have all kinds of new ideas to be putting in here. So, really what the tool is going to help us do is iterate on this vision and turn it into a collective vision that everybody supports because they understand the trade-offs and the needs that went into making it. Next slide. Thank you so much for listening. I think I'm about right on time, and I'm really excited to get to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. A lot in there to think about. And we already have a few questions coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and transition to those and would just encourage everyone to continue dropping questions into chat and or raise your hand, and I'll track those moving forward. So thank you so much for that presentation, Letitia. I really appreciate it. So the first question is from Travis Hinkelman, and he asks, are any of the modules particularly data poor relative to others? And in specifically, did developing the tool help to identify areas where better data is needed to make more accurate predictions? And maybe some of what he's getting at as well is sort of error analysis around that, or uncertainty analysis.
Yeah, those are both great questions. Yes, certainly we lack data in some areas compared to others. One that we have like almost no information about is wetlands that are managed different ways in different years. That's really challenging. So sometimes these areas that are managed for waterfowl use are managed differently in different years, or pop-up habitats. So we really wanted to have a module about water bird support, for example, which is very important. We have declines in some of the migratory water birds, but we couldn't do that because we just couldn't find the data. A more sort of in the middle example is the California Protected Areas database. So we were trying to think about, can we create modules of both where is the public land that we might want to focus on for ecosystem restoration, but also where are the places for recreation themselves. But there were so many errors in the database that people kind of were not happy with how that turned out. And so we got some funding to try to fix the database, as well as creating the modules to show outcomes from that. So you're absolutely right. In terms of uncertainty analysis, that is such a great question. Where we can, we do estimate uncertainty. For example, if we have a habitat map, if you dig into the metadata, you will often see an estimate of uncertainty, it really varies, but it could be just like literally how many meters of uncertainty, but sometimes it's like high, medium, low when we're looking at, say, historical records and reading journal articles and saying, well, journal entries of like a pioneer, who recorded, we might say, well, we only have one source for this, but 6 sources said that this, wetland was here. So that's difficult. Rolling up uncertainty into some kind of visualization in the tool itself. We started there years ago, and it was very complicated technically because of all the different kinds of uncertainty they're factoring in. And also the users were just like, no, we hate this, make it go away. So as you all know, that sometimes happens. Trying to convey the complexity of the uncertainty really sort of dilutes the message for the user or distracts them. So we haven't had a ton of success with making that simpler or easier, but I would love ideas if anyone has them.
It's a complicated element to include. And I think exactly as you said, is to how do you translate that into something that ultimately helps to facilitate the decision-making process as opposed to sort of hindering it and binding it. So.
Yeah, and one way is to have like mini scenarios to kind of bookend it. It's not real like quantitative uncertainty, but it helps a decision maker be like, oh, okay, I could be in this space. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I guess one of the questions I'd like to ask is really, how do you ensure, how are the feedbacks between the different components within sort of scenarios being investigated? How does that get rolled up and as part of the analysis that comes out?
Great question. This is probably where we're reaching the limits of my knowledge. If you saw the models in GIS that are used to make some of these analyses, it's unbelievably complicated. I should have brought that slide, but it's like the most complicated one I've ever seen is the one we use to create the hydrologically connected areas. Because there are so many feedbacks, well, in this kind of year, we assume this, area would drain to that area based on the elevation, but only if the flow is at this rate. So if the flow is under this rate, there's all these kind of dependencies and it's literally built into the code of the GIS analysis. So that's what I know. We have tried thinking, I don't know if this is what you're asking, but like more dynamically connecting the tool to other models, like to, a hydrodynamic model would be one good example. Very complicated and expensive, and we haven't done that yet. I think it could be done, but it would be, we would need to know exactly why, because nobody's going to want to spend that kind of money until we're sure that there's a user that's going to make something good out of that. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but so far it's looking at, the model can go grab data from somewhere, like a spatial data set, think about it, process it through the ARC code, like I was talking about, and then output the output, but it's not dynamically connecting to an external source right now. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And that's a helpful description. And I think one of the questions that we just got is in response to that. And so you kind of, as you were developing that interconnected waters scenario, you said that you sort of set some assumptions around how the flows would travel between different years and the like. And so Abby asks, can you change some of those flows in the parameterization of those models, or is that set?
No, that's what you can do. So if there's a way that, so if those parameters the parameters are kind of essentially those spatial data sets that you're inputting into the tool. So if you were to input a wet year data set that looked different than a dry year data set, that would give you that did give us the different outcomes that we got in that first map where we had the wet year and dry year. So that's how you're able to change the inputs into the ARC code that gets you a different output. Does that make sense? It's very spatial right now. It's not, again, connected to like a hydrodynamic model that says the flow is this many cubic feet per second. It's spatial. It says the flow means this much of the land was inundated.
Right.
And then we know based on another data set how high each, the elevation of each part of the land. So it takes like your information on how much was inundated, and then the model is cross-referencing that with the elevations of different places, and thus deciding, okay, well, if it was wet here, then that could flow down to here because I know from my other data set that this is higher than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that kind of help? It's also, I should just say, I'm not the GIS person, and we have super smart, inventive team. I'm just going to add that to the description. They are so inventive and smart. And so they both know GIS really well, but they also really know the delta. And so I think they were able to make smart assumptions. We work as a team, so there's lots of us sort of checking and weighing in. And then when we were doing a lot of the original science, and now we always have a technical advisory team, so we can always go to some external independent source and kind of say, what does this seem right? And we need help with this. So we try to be as robust as possible with those kind of checks and balances, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thanks.
Sorry about the sun on me. I'm just going to move my sun shield for 1 second.
Sure. And maybe what I'll do is go ahead, and we have sort of 5 minutes left within what I call the more formal portion of this. But as I mentioned, we will stay on until a maximum of 1:30. But what I'd like to tee up is sort of this broader question around thinking about the tool as it's currently developed and what kind of analysis this group might consider using the tool for. And in particular, one of the things that I think was really highlighted here is that this is a modular tool, and it was developed to be a modular tool. And so as this team thinks about expanding the tool both within the Delta, but potentially to other regions, what additional information would people like to see within it? Or what would you add to it to make it useful for your specific applications? And would love to hear people's thoughts on that, and whether you want to raise your hand or ask questions directly to Letitia or drop things into the chat. Any of that would be fantastic, but would love to hear people's sort of thoughts about how you might use the tool and what would help you to make it really useful to scenarios that you're thinking through. I see Lauren is weighing in the chat here. She says water quality metrics would be useful, for example, salinity, nitrates, etc.
That's really helpful. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And maybe we could partner with the Delta RMP for that. Helpful.
And Lauren, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you feel comfortable, if you want to come off mute and talk a little bit about how you would envision using those and sort of what sort of scenarios you would like to see. Great. And okay, if you're not comfortable too, that's fine. Anyone else?
I'm not a Delta expert, and I don't work on the Delta in my day-to-day work, so I'm not the best person to expound upon this. But it just seems like this is something that in the water management world is often very important, is tracking, the seawater intrusion into the Delta as it fluctuates with the tides and the changing flows, and having some water quality metrics could be very important from a habitat standpoint as well as a water management standpoint.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else? One of the components I found really useful within the tool, Letitia, is the ability to think about how the landscape could change through time and actually tie that directly to different economic outcomes, and just really see that as being a valuable tool. And I know that we've talked a little bit about how this tool could potentially be applied within, for example, Central Valley, as we think about a transition under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I don't know if others have thoughts on that, or that's something that others would be thinking about, but that link particularly to economic impacts, I think is interesting. And I see Emmanuel asked a question here: community profiles of regions and economic profiles of industries. So mapping and visualizing those would be useful in terms of getting a sense of community and the economic impacts on those communities.
These are great ideas. And I'm curious, Emmanuel, what's a metric in a community profile? Like how many people live there? What kind of jobs they have? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah, that would be a very useful information, because by then we could show some economic scenarios, these scenarios that there's no, so the planning tool, if we could integrate the socioeconomic profile of communities, because by that we could get a sense of those vulnerable communities that might be impacted. And having a sense of the economic industries situated in those regions that we're analyzing would also be useful in getting a sense of those. So those are, if we could integrate those in the models, I just thought it would be useful, in getting a sense, not just the ecosystem impacts and all those benefits that we're attributing, but also looking at the third-party impacts that may be associated, so that we could have an informed decision-making in terms of how to mitigate those impacts from a policy perspective.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I love that idea.
Yeah, and I'm just cognizant of time, so I'm going to say a formal thank you to Letitia Grenier for being here today. Really appreciate it. Fantastic presentation. And for those who need to drop off for 1 o'clock meetings or the like, but again, we'll stay on and continue the discussion. And so thank you. And Abby asks, or states sort of climate change scenarios are a big component in planning for purveyors. And so potentially expanding it for water agencies to use could be a good alternative that they could use to support some of their required reporting. And she points to the Urban Water Management Plans or Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
And would those be, what aspects of climate? I'm again curious, like, is that about thinking about different rainfall scenarios, that kind of thing?
I think she had to drop off, unfortunately.
Okay.
But I do have her name if you wanted to follow up then.
Thank you.
How would people envision using this tool, or do you envision using the tool for your own, as you think about your own applications? Letitia, I was curious how you talked a little bit about proposal evaluation and project tracking. And so as you think about that, are you really taking sort of, does that include taking an existing a proposal, for example, building out the scenarios included within that and then using that to track through time? Or what does that look like sort of pragmatically?
Yeah, that's a good question. It kind of depends on, how far an agency would want to go in terms of having these scenarios included in the proposal. But you could imagine I imagine them as being separate, where, if I get 6 proposals for a wetland restoration project, I might want to look in the scenario tool and say, well, which one is really, if my funding source is related to, say, salmon restoration, or maybe I'm interested in trying to support salmon, but I know I can't use much water, right? So this needs to be a wetland-based restoration approach, not a flows-based restoration approach. And so then I would probably look at those elements of the tool that can compare the scenarios and say, okay, which one is delivering more in terms of the functions I'm interested in? And are there any hidden impacts that I wasn't thinking of? Like, wow, this one's great, but it really impacts the agricultural industry more than that one. And there was an analysis we did of Frank's Tract, you're probably aware of the planning process, and Frank's Tract is a flooded island, and there's a desire to restore it. And the original restoration plan wasn't widely accepted by the community, but there was a community-based process of thinking through different futures. And we used the landscape scenario planning tool to look at the different futures. And what we found was that the sort of solely ecological scenario that didn't include what people wanted, basically, local people wanted, wasn't that much different ecologically from the one that did include what the local people wanted. So you could really increase your local stakeholder satisfaction with only slight changes to the ecological outcomes. And so I think it's that kind of insight that you might get from your looking at different proposals, saying, wow, you know, I was thinking this one was way better, but actually that one is almost as good, and yet it has these other benefits or less impacts or something. So I think it's kind of those hidden, to me, it's not worth using the tool because it's extra work unless it provides some insight that you're not going to get without using it. So to me, that's how it might help with the proposal situation. In terms of tracking projects on the ground, I think that's kind of already embedded in what you're seeing. So Eco Restore includes projects that started a long time ago. And so once you've actually, so to me, the future projection is like, I'm planning to put a tidal marsh here, but whether or not you really get a tidal marsh there, that's a real world thing that happens in the future. Once you've done the project and you've seen the outcome and you've mapped it, and somebody said, whoops, that's not a tidal marsh, that's a riparian area. Okay, that would be a really big mistake. But, you know, pretending that it came out different than you thought, that's when you're tracking the project performance. And you might be saying, okay, actually, well, we didn't get those 100 acres toward our Delta Plan goal for tidal marsh, but we did get them toward this other goal. And you would be essentially changing the trajectory of what you thought was going to happen to the reality of what actually did happen. And so the reason I put there in there is to acknowledge there's a difference between making a polygon in a GIS database and saying that's what it shall be, and what it actually turns into on the landscape. And the tool can help you with both, because we are operating on these very long time trajectories. I hope that relates to the question you were actually asking me, Tara.
Yeah, no, really great examples. Thank you. Really helpful. And I really like the example you provided with the sort of proposal development. And I can see it being such a valuable tool and sort of helping people, like you said, really think through the trade-offs of both the desired outcomes, but also what that means in terms of both other benefits as well as impacts. And I think there's just so much power in there, particularly, as you said, given the complexity of the scenarios being just being considered. And that's true whether it's in the Delta, but if you were to take this tool and potentially apply it elsewhere as well. So really, really fantastic. I have one more question if other people don't have any, but yeah, I would encourage others here, if you have questions, feel free to come off mute.
Or even turned your video on.
Exactly.
It'd be thrilling for me.
We talked a little bit when we spoke previously about sort of starting to pull in some environmental justice metrics and DEI or disadvantaged communities, and just curious if others have thoughts on that or how you've been thinking about that, Letitia, as you've been considering that, and how you would envision incorporating those.
I'm happy to speak to that unless one of you who's joined us wants to. Yeah. I think that there may be voices in the Delta where the tool is currently oriented that we're not hearing from, like the people that work on the farms. Don't hear from them. The tribes, I think we haven't heard enough about what they want the Delta to do. There may be there are disadvantaged communities in different areas around the Delta, and maybe they are using the Delta for different things like subsistence fishing, which has some issues with contamination. Maybe they aren't because they don't have access. I think there's probably a lot of voices that just we actually haven't heard from. And so what I think would be really great is to try to figure out which communities are there that, the current language is live, work, or play in the Delta, who might want to use that resource and is or isn't using it and what matters to them. And could we create a metric so that there's we're not just hearing from, like, what I think we hear from right now is government and landowners the most, and fishers to some degree, sport fisher people. But I'm guessing there's more out there, and I think we need to more actively pursue that, since, you know, as we all know, the events of the past few years have shown us that government isn't representing everyone equally. So we're probably missing some viewpoints.
Yeah. Yeah, it's getting people to the table initially to really help guide some of those the discussions really that need to happen around how are people using the landscape, and how is it working and not working to achieve sort of their goals long term. Yeah.
Exactly. And how would those future scenarios impact it? So we have started talking to the tribes a little bit, and there's definitely a lack of representation of, you know, thinking about their traditional ecological resources, and not to mention just implementing what they already know, and thinking about that in some of our metrics, but, you know, sacred sites and resources that they traditionally use culturally. So that's hopefully a low-hanging fruit that we'll be able to tackle sometime.
That's encouraging.
Low-hanging is definitely in quotes, but that's one I know about.
No, but again, it's just, you know, getting people to the table and starting those conversations. So that's exciting. Any other questions?
Not a question so much as just thank you for your presentation. My name is Carly, and this is my first time at one of the Data for Lunches, and I cannot wait for the next one because this was a fantastic way to start. So thank you very much.
Glad you could join, Carly.
That's so nice. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, unless there are any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and finish this off. But the other thing I should have said previously is that you provided a link on the website or on your PowerPoint to the tool itself and the landing page for it. And so I would encourage people to go and have a look and explore a very cool and very powerful tool. So
yeah,
thank
send
you
us an
so
email.
much.
Get in touch. Feel free. I don't know if I put my email on at the end.
I actually looked at it and thought you didn't.
I did not. Oh, I did.
Oh, no, you did. Sorry. Yes, you were here along with
I'll put
Lydia.
it in the chat right now.
Great.
Can't if I can spell my own name. Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being here, though. It's a really cool tool and exciting to see it roll out.